Force
Right.
changes reality. Power struggles with it. But over time, what happens is you begin to get this. This is that, by the way, the Kurzweil curve. You get this experience where more and more and more force is actually the only way to play.
Welcome to Grail Country. I have with me today Jordan Hall, who has been on the channel before, but was gracious enough to come and talk to me again. We had a conversation that was kind of lost to the internet, where I had sent Jordan a bunch of pages from Meditations on the Tarot, which he had not yet read. And I was kind of like making some comparisons between his work and what Tomberg is talking about in a particular letter of Meditations on the Tarot, which is letter 10, which is the letter on the Wheel of Fortune. And I originally had an idea of like working some Girardian theory into this conversation with a couple of Girard scholars, but they weren't able to make it. So it's just going to be a conversation between Jordan and I. So hopefully, I think Jordan probably will be in a little bit better position than I had him in the last time, when I kind of just like, here's this weird thing that you've never seen before. What do you think about it?
Which is, by the way, not a slightly weird thing. It's a lot weird thing.
Yeah, it's a lot weird thing. Yes, absolutely, for sure, 100%. The reason I shared it with you because I just like I had this intuition that it would that particular section of Meditations at least would connect to you deeply because of your work with Game B.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially the problem that Tomberg is diagnosing in this letter is the same problem that you were trying to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that there would be some resonance because of that. And just to set up, let me go ahead, actually, I want to go ahead and read like the core of like, this is it's a long letter and there's a lot to it, but there's a part that I want to focus on that I think connects very closely to your previous work. And so that is where he lays out his little myth. So I'm going to go ahead and just read that part of the text. So Tomberg writes, "Do not be shocked, dear unknown friend, and do forgive me, for I'm going to relate a myth. A cosmic myth from the Gnosis, not ancient or modern, but from the eternal Gnosis, because the cosmic drama is in reality a myth made flesh, and it must first be seen as such before one draws principal intellectual lessons from it. Therefore, I'm going to relate the myth in order to draw from it some ideas, which are related to the arcanum of the tarot with which we are occupied. When the Father had accomplished his work on the seventh day of creation that he had made through his word, he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. And the Father blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because on this day he rested from all his work that he had created. Thus the seventh day is blessed and sanctified, because it is the day not of the world and the movement of the world, but rather of the Father himself alone. It is the seventh part of the circle of movement of the world, where he withdraws and becomes immobile and silent. Thus it is that the circle of movement of the world was not closed, but remained open, and the seventh day was sanctified and blessed as the open part of the circle of movement of the world, in such a way that the beings of the world had access to the Father, and the Father had access to them. But the serpent said, there is no freedom for the world, insofar as the circle of the world is not closed, because freedom is to be in oneself without interference from the outside, especially from above on the part of the Father. The world will always follow the will of the Father, and it is not its own insofar as there is an opening in the circle of the world, insofar as Sabbath exists. And the serpent took his tail in his mouth, and thus formed a closed circle. He turned himself with great force and thus created in the world the great swirl which caught hold of Adam and Eve and the other beings upon whom Adam had impressed the names that he gave to them, followed them. And the serpent said to the beings of the world moving on this side of the closed circle that he formed by taking his tail in his mouth and setting himself in rotation, here is your way. You will commence by my tail and you will arrive at my head. Then you will have traversed the length of the circle of my being, and you will have within you the entire closed circle, and thus you will be free as I am free. But woman guarded the memory of the world open toward the Father and the holy Sabbath. And she offered herself for the rending of the closed circle in herself in order to give birth to children issuing from the world beyond it, from the world where there is the Sabbath. Thus originated the suffering of her pregnancy, and thus originated sorrow on this side of the world of the serpent. And hostility came between woman and the serpent, between the generations of woman, giving birth with pain, and the generations of the serpent, giving birth with pleasure. The former will crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent will wound the heel of the woman. For the woman moves in a contrary sense to the movement of the serpent, and her head reaches to the tail of the serpent, and her heels touch the head of the serpent. This is because in the world, which is the current of the serpent, suffering is its counter movement. It was through the counter movement of suffering that there originated the counter current of the sons of woman, which is the thought born from suffering and the memory of the world of the Sabbath. Thus the sons of woman set up altars to the Father, this side of the world of the serpent. And Enosh, the son of Seth, not only worshipped the Father, but even came to know his name. He began to invoke the name of the Father. But Enoch, a descendant of Seth, went still further. He walked with God. He did not pass through the bitterness of death, which for living beings is on this side of the circle of the serpent, is the way out of the closed circle of the serpent. For he was taken up by the Father. Genesis 24. For about that time, thought aspiring to the Father succeeded in piercing the circle of the serpent and in accomplishing an opening in the closed circle. Thus, initiation and prophecy could be established on this side of the world of the serpent. Initiation kept living memory of the world of the Sabbath, and prophecy nourished the hope of deliverance from the circle of the serpent and the future reestablishment of the world of the Sabbath. Buddhists taught the way of going out from the world of the serpent and arriving at the repose of the Sabbath. But prophets proclaimed the transformation of the world of the serpent from within by the coming of the Word, which will live in the world of the serpent and will reestablish the world of the serpent, will reestablish within the world of the serpent not only the Sabbath, but also the other 6 days of creation, such as they were before a third of the beings from each of them were uprooted and swept down by the closed whirlwind of the serpent. This came to be. The woman virgin, who is the soul of the counter movement of the serpent, and the suffering since the beginning of the world of the serpent, received, conceived, and gave birth to the Word of the Father, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst the men in the world of the serpent, full of grace and truth. This is the cosmic myth, the esoteric drama which underlies the exoteric process of evolution. It sets forth, in the first place, the idea of the open circle and the closed circle. The open circle or spiral is the world before the fall of the 6 days of creation, crowned by the seventh day, the cosmic Sabbath, which corresponds to what one designates in mathematics as the step of the spiral. It suggests the idea of an unlimited growth and advancement, being through its form only the introduction or antechamber to eternity. It promises unlimited progress. The closed circle, in contrast, is in principle only a prison, whatever its extent may be. It is a wheel which turns on itself and therefore suggests no advancement beyond its circle. The idea that the closed circle or wheel suggests is that of eternal repetition. So that's the basic like cosmic myth that Tom Berg outlays in this chapter, and I think that this is fundamentally when you were doing your game B work at some level, like this is the problem that you have an intuition of, that you had an intuition of. And I think there's been several ways of framing this. And Tomberg actually talks about them in other parts of Meditations on the Tarot in similar language too, like Paul Kingsnorth's idea of the machine, which is like inspired by Jacques Ellul and others, is the same kind of thing. It's like this system that of things that just kind of like happen automatically and unconsciously, which is why the machine is like a perfect metaphor for it. That is another representation of the closed circle. I would say the reason I invited some Girard scholars, that I would say that the problem that Girard lays forth in the Medic theory, the cycle of Satan driving out Satan, is precisely actually, the fact that he ties it directly to Satan makes it maybe even closer to what Tomberg is talking about in this myth than in some of its other forms. So lots of people have seen this problem, right? And I've had an intuition about this problem. And then the question is like, okay, what do we do about it? And earlier in the same letter, Tomberg uses this analogy. He talks about a ship, right? We think of the world as a ship, that there are people who are aboard the ship that are merely passengers, for whom it seems that everything just happens of its own accord. Mm-hmm. That is very much like the mentality of like the closed world frame, because it's like you have no agency in the direction or destination of the ship. But from the point of view of the crew, it is entirely different, because the crew very much like has to be like watchful and alert and very attuned to like where the ship is going. And I can see, like, it seems like you're kind of like, you're in a place, like, I think it seems to me like, having watched you recently, you're kind of in this place where it's like, you like have learned to have like this proper stance of humility, of like maybe letting go of the fact that you should be the captain of the ship kind of thing, and figure out exactly where it should go and how. But at the same time, I think that you weren't interested in this problem for no reason, right? Like there's a way in which that maybe you needed to go through a season of being in passenger mode in order to renew yourself, and actually to experience Sabbath for yourself. But at some point, I think you probably need to get back on the crew. That's just my intuition. All
right. So, obviously, there was a very large amount. Let's see. Let's just start at the end there. So,
yeah.
Well, no, actually, what I'll do is there are two ships. There's the ship that is sailing the game A ship, and then there's the ship that is sailing the game B ship, and there are two crews.
Right.
So I think the passenger crew metaphor, I'm not sure that I can hang with that in the moment. But I can definitely hang with the two ships and two crews metaphor. And the difference is, of course, the crew of ship A is the inverted, or the hanged man, not hanged, right? The man who is proceeding by his own understanding. The intelligence, not the intuition, like all these distinctions.
Just really quick there. I think there can appear to be two ships, but unless we want to accept some sort of fundamental dualism, which I think is a mistake, then there's really only one ship.
Well, I mean, the problem is that there is a fundamental dualism and there's not a fundamental dualism. Right? There's both from this is funny. I actually used this phrase. From the point of view of game A, there's a game A and a game B. From the point of view of game B, there's not.
Okay. Fair enough.
And so from the point of view of the hanged man, there's not. But from the point of view of the man who's not aware, who's being pulled by the gravitational attractor of gravitation, not levity,
Right.
there is. So it's, that's the point. So this is good though. This is useful because we can say, hey, if you have not yet moved through that topsy-turvy portal where you've begun to learn how to be a crew member in the Upside Down Kingdom, then you will perceive there as being two ships, and
Gotcha.
you will likely endeavor to steer your ship well, right? This is one of the problems, right? But the point is, you will perceive shoals.
Well, there's also the possibility. There's also kind of the Nietzschean possibility of seeing a single ship, but just being okay with driving it straight to perdition and confusing perdition with ultimate reality.
Well, yeah. Well, so we could actually break that apart, because you could say is that in the context of maybe this is even useful. Let's zoom in on the game A frame for the moment.
Okay, let's do it.
So when you zoom in on the game A frame, what you see is that it is governed by this law. What do you call it? You call it energy, I think, or electricity. Right? The law of electricity, which is the whirlwind of the serpent.
He does also point toward the law of conservation of energy as being a closed world principle too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the point of that is that in a closed world, you have finite resources, and therefore it is intrinsically rivalrous, meaning we are ultimately going to be fighting. We may not be right now, like we may have more than enough now. This is kind of the Girardian problem of the Thiel's approach. As long as we can continue to produce more finite resources, more than enough, we won't actually get to tooth and claw.
As long as it's possible to share, you don't it doesn't present a problem. It's only when when the objects of the mimetic rivalry become impossible to share that you have a crisis that emerges.
Right. And so
which is inherently rooted in a view of scarcity, limitedness, and finitude as reality. I think is an error Girard makes. I think Girard actually doesn't quite understand
the
depths of his own theory, because his anthropology is slightly askew in such a way that he misses. I think Girard, like the disciples, I did this long conversation once on the passage where Jesus laments that the disciples did not understand about the loaves and the fishes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And them not understanding about the loaves and the fishes was them not understanding that everything is fundamentally plenitude.
Right.
There is no scarcity.
It's like, what? Didn't you guys just see me just make lots of loaves? Was that lost on you? They're just like, yeah, of course it's lost on me. I'm still a Bronze Age mindset.
Well, I don't think we can kind of we can be intellectually aware of this, but aware of it at one point, right? We can, there's a way in which we can be intellectually aware.
We can be intellectually aware,
but it's hard for us to have faith in it.
Yeah. That's exactly the distinction. We can be intellectually aware, but not yet have actually cultivated faith, and therefore not be able to live that way. Yeah.
Yep.
And so,
precisely.
So if I zoom in, and so we're now in this world where, let's say by hypothesis, and it doesn't matter at this moment whether Girard is actually in there, but we're in this frame where the horizon of your perception is entirely bound by a reality that is governed by the laws of scarcity, which is, and I prefer the myth that you just read to the story I'm telling, but the story I'm telling, I can tell.
That's good.
So what happens in that particular game, and by the way, I can actually superimpose sort of Jordan Peterson's hierarchy of values and this kind of the attractors of what does it look like to be able to consistently win-lose games. Well, it turns out, weirdly enough, by the way, right, where it turns out that honor and truthfulness actually produces a more effective team than people who constantly betray each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what Nietzsche does is Nietzsche says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to, oddly enough, exactly, I think what Peterson's doing weirdly. Well, no, that's not true. The 3/4 of what Peterson is doing is I'm going to basically say, let's figure out what is the infinite regress on the attractor of what does it look like to win-lose games, and just do that. So don't actually even play the game, the object level game anymore. Play the meta game of what does it look like to be the one that wins all games. And when you do that, you're actually winning the win-lose game. By hypothesis, you're saying, hey, I'm becoming the greatest player of all possible win-lose games. And therefore, I have now definitively won. That's the Nietzsche's thing, is say, hey, drop the particular game, elevate to being able to notice how games work in general, and now become the greatest possible player of all possible win-lose games. And once you hit that point, you've won the game. So that's the sort of, and you say that once you realize that you're governed by the laws of scarcity, what have you won exactly? You've won something which is ultimately governed by a deeper set of laws like entropy.
Right.
Even though you are holding on to a kingdom, now have King Conan, if you know that image, right? You've
Yes,
actually
I do.
become, right? You're sitting on the throne. You are the king, but your head is hanging because you're sitting on the kingdom of rot, right? The kingdom of decay, the kingdom of death, which of course, you're sitting directly underneath the prince of this world, who is in fact exactly that player.
Yes.
All right. So now what happens is we notice that, and we notice something else. This was for me. So what I began to notice was,
and that's interesting, because I was just re-listening to my friend Dr. Chris Green's sermon, God is Not a Master. I was just re-listening to this morning before our conversation, and he has this great part of the sermon where he talks about the person who wants to see themselves as the master and king and winner of all possible games, King Conan is a good image of Enki, right? Ultimately, all of that accumulation is about insulating themselves against death.
Yep.
And that's precisely what you can't cling to. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so I began to notice this part that is in the myth of about how through the woman, which is really interesting. I hadn't I've read that part 2 or 3 times, but now when I heard you read it, I saw that more clearly. The eruption of eternity into the closed circle.
Right, and he follows this up because we won't have time to even barely touch the surface of this. But the next, it's just worth mentioning, as you mentioned, that he follows this up. The very next letter in Meditations on Montero is letter 11, which is on the Arcanum of Force, which ironically ends up being virginal love, like the love that is represented by the woman, by the virgin. That is what the Arcanum that is what the Arcanum of Force is. And
yes, okay, great. So take the image of that, right? Take the image of the virginal love, and particularly the womb, as the vehicle through which eternity incarnates into the closed circle. In all cases, not specifically the incarnation, but every kind of every time the creation.
Well, Saint Maximus the Confessor is Ambiguum 722. It's the Word of God, very, very God, wishes to repeat the mystery of his own incarnation in all things.
Yeah.
So it's of course, there wouldn't be any other pattern.
So what we find in the context of Geimei, and particularly late stage Geimei, is there's a fascinating discovery. For me, it's most sharp at the point of Alan Turing, but it's continuous. But it becomes very sharp at the point of Alan Turing, because what is discovered is by the King Conans of the world, right, who are still ultimately endeavoring to win that game, right? Win the game of entropy, of energy. It is only by maximally allowing creation to presence itself in the world that they're actually able to compete with each other. Does that make sense? There was a previous moment. Let's go back to let's just go all the way back to the Bronze Age, where what already is relatively static for a long period of time. We fight with the same basic weapons for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Right. So the innovation of the chariot's a big fucking deal. And then for 1,000 years, that's what we do. And so everybody's navigating a particular landscape on the basis of a particular state of affairs. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that you do. Like there's a category of strategy and tactics and deployment of energy and power that is the power, not force. That is the nature of what it looks like to win that game. But then somebody comes along and, invents a new kind of thing. Creation breaks the circle and brings a new possibility into the world. And that guy weirdly spontaneously starts to win because, of course, he's playing in a whole new world until a new equilibrium establishes in the category. So what happens is that force changes reality, power struggles with it, but over time, what happens is you begin to get this, and this is that, by the way, the Kurzweil curve, you get this experience where more and more and more force is actually the only way to play. That power has to go, oh, shoot, we need to do the Manhattan Project. We need to do, the Bletchley Park. We have to keep doing this thing. And it's like, power begins to ephemeralize, but still trying to maintain itself as the center of reality, while more and more and more reality has to be governed by the nature of force, because that's the only way to actually bring creation into reality. And so this is the pivot point between A and B for me, is to say, hey, what happens if we accept that as being true and merely get rid of the power part, or even just invert them? You say, hey, what happens if you allow force to be the nature of reality? I mean, now the arcanum of force specifically, which is maybe mysterious if you haven't read it, but what happens? Because if that's the vector, if that's the direction we've been heading, is this process of more and more and more of force being the thing that matters and power being an increasingly ephemeral control structure on top of a deeper nature of force, what happens if we just allow that increasingly ephemeral to just ephemeralize and invert? And so that the hanged man, right? That's the inversion. The hanged man is the vertical man that we ordinarily see as the game A man, who is power governing force. What happens if you flip it and allow force to govern? Then you're on the other side, right?
Well, this is precisely why I think that's the sequence that he goes through in those three letters, right? It's like that's a sequence. He begins with like, okay, this is the arcanum of the wheel. This is the problem. This is how this is where the problem is. This is what initiates it. This is the characteristics that define it. This is how you know you're stuck within this problem. Letter 11, the arcanum of force. This is the thing. And then the hangman is like, it is like about finding the balance point to actually like bring that to fruition in your life.
Yes. And so a primary problem, this is actually really interesting. A primary problem that we ran into, and we're probably talking about 2014, 2015, is that when you go through that transition, right, you invert, right, become the hanged man. Everything inverts. And in particular, the thing that is most confusing is the relationship between, what is it? I know that mind something will. Can't remember what the middle move is. But let's just go like for me it's a V. So in this chapter, it's mind, heart, and will. Mind, heart, will. That's exactly right. Yeah. So in game A, it goes mind, heart, will. Right. And in game B, it goes will, heart, mind. Right. And that it's very disorienting because it's like trying to drive in a review mirror. That everything is completely different, or it's actually not even different. It's like if you go through a Klein bottle, it's actually that. Like it's not even upside down. It's this dimensionally, and it's perfectly transverse. So that's very confusing. Like it's very difficult for almost anybody who hasn't actually really begun to practice living on the other side of that inversion, the hanged man, to grasp what it means to live by means of that. Because as he talks about in that arcanum, you notice that you are already acting on God's purposes, well before you have any idea what the fuck is going on.
Right. Yes. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Precisely. It. Like. Okay. So I use this often. I use this often to illustrate what Rudolf Steiner is trying to drive at in his philosophy of freedom, because I think it's a good concrete illustration. But I think it actually illustrates what we're trying to talk about right now too, because I think ultimately we are talking about freedom.
Yes.
But not the illusory freedom that is being offered by the serpent in the closed circle, but real freedom. And the parable of the Good Samaritan is really, really good for this. So I think Steiner is effectively right when he says this. He says this in Philosophy of Freedom. He says that the man who simply follows his desires and the man who simply follows essentially the law, tradition, for its own sake, does what their culture dictates they should do because it's what they should do, that they're effectively both enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The Good Samaritan does something that is. Talbert also says in Meditations on Botero, anything that is truly done is a miraculous, and that everything else just simply happens automatically. Well, what the Samaritan does is truly miraculous because he definitely didn't get the idea from his cultural context. He definitely wasn't following his desires. He spontaneously cooperates with the will of the Father and accomplishes something truly good and beautiful in the world. And then Jesus points at it, and then it kind of, like, I think Illich is right that we've made it lose its, because we've just turned it into a maxim or a moralism, we've lost the power of what's really there.
Yes. Well, this is the
force,
continuous.
I would say, actually, the force of what's really there, which is that, like, he is cultivated in himself enough of that, like, virginal space that allows God to enter and for him to cooperate with God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, golly, there's so many things to unpack. So let's just tease out one small piece, I think, that may be useful. That distinction you made. So we in our ordinary world, we will often have the distinction between liberty and tyranny.
Yeah.
And the liberty person says, as long as I get to do what I want, which is to say, as long as I get to be entirely governed by my desires, but no one else's desires, then I have liberty. I'm going to distinguish that from freedom just because it's linguistically easier.
Sure.
And the opposite, right? If I am governed by the law, I am subject to tyranny. And I'm presumably there's some inversion of that. And the point is that that's a false dichotomy. That's the point, is that that's actually the perspective of somebody who is ultimately still within the mindset of someone who is living in the prison. Right? Only a prisoner thinks that being able to be free of the law is freedom.
Right.
A free person realizes that being able to participate in the actual creativity of reality is freedom, which has nothing to do with being governed by your own desires.
Yeah, that's why it's important to note. That's why it's important to note. And I said the person who follows the law simply because it is the law.
Yeah, exactly.
Like there's nothing. That is just.
That's not it.
That's not it.
Neither. But the key is there's always the third, right? It's neither is it.
Like a faithful Orthodox Jew who keeps as much of the Torah as possible because they love God is not what I'm talking about.
No.
At all.
No.
Okay. Just want to
Yes, that's right. Clear. Yeah, and there's and it's not Hegelian. Like, it's not you take you're governed by your desires and governed by the law and sort of blend them together into some new synthesis. It's the exact inverse of that. It's like, no. There's a more fundamental thing that is neither of those two, that is more real than either. And that has to, and that's the thing that we're calling freedom, right? And it will superficially look like one or the other, depending on which point of view you have, if you're superficial. But if you're not superficial, then it looks like neither.
Right.
So if I'm coming at it from the point of view of liberty, and I say, well, I am allowing myself to be entirely governed by the purposes of the Father, then superficially it will look like, oh, what you're saying is you're giving up your will and just living according to somebody else's rules. Like, no, that's a perfectly superficial view of it. That's completely upside down and wrong. But I can see how you would see it that way. And I'm sure the opposite, right? I am ultimately, and this is the Pharisees' response to Christ in a certain sense. It's like, wait, so you're just kind of tossing the law out entirely?
Right.
What the hell? Like, you're a complete libertine? It's like, no. Completely the opposite of that. You're not seeing it clearly. You're seeing it maximally superficially, and that's why it appears to be that way. So that's one. Like, we can pull that out. Like this, and this, like, notice there's like 5 or 6 things there. There's the, when you're trapped in the false dichotomy of the upside down world, the resolution is not either one or the other, or a synthesis of the two, but rather to transverse the world and notice that there's a more fundamental reality that is in fact neither of the false dichotomy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's related to like my friend Dr. Green's sermon that I rewatched today too, because like that's why he's pointing at like the error that we make in reading the master and slave dynamic back into the relationship between God and the world. It's like, I'm sorry, but the idea of human beings as a slave to the gods, that's just a Near Eastern pagan despotism. That has nothing to do with the gospel at all. But we kind of like subconsciously do this all the time because that closed world trap is such an ingenious trap. The serpent is clever.
Yeah, but the serpent is perfectly clever.
Right.
and one of the places the serpent loves is the next move, which is cool. You got it totally figured out. Great. But keep it at the level of the intellect.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, right, that's you can have a perfect understanding of it as long as it's your understanding. It's like good. Yeah. I'll give you all of that. And
whereas with Stalberg, it's very clear that it's actually in the heart.
Yes, and in the heart's the pivot point.
I'm to understand it.
And the intellect then plays this weird role of being in like, so rather than like, how would you say, figuring it out,
right?
It's more like curiosity.
Well, like because why? Because we're turning it into our thing.
Yes,
when we use the intellect, that then we gain possession over it. But here's the thing: it's like, okay, so and possession is actually connected to this too, because like God, who like, okay, in our idolatrous thought about God, we are projecting our own desires for power up into the heavenlies, and we create a God that is like the maximum of power that we can imagine. Mm-hmm. But then God reveals himself to us and reveals himself to be precisely the opposite of that. So it's like he does like everything he does and says like contradict that way of thinking altogether.
Yep.
And they don't make any logical sense within the closed world. It doesn't make any sense. Like love your enemies. What are you talking about?
That makes no sense. Exactly. What are you talking about?
Zero sense.
And so let's also piece that. So one of the other things that the serpent loves to do is, let me see if I can do this right. So take the hanged man.
Yeah.
And then create an image of the hanged man that contains the characteristics of the behaviors that you see, and express those behaviors, but still by the virtue of the unhanged man or the gravitational man.
Right. And what happens, and the reason that doesn't work is that it ends up becoming transactional. Like you will make it transactional.
Yeah. Yeah.
You make it transactional because of like, see, God here. I never got to my point about possession. It's like, so God, right? Who the scriptures tell us that everything belongs to God, right? Right. In fact, one time I had this conversation with this Orthodox Jewish friend of mine who lives in Israel, and we're having a conversation about the conflict in Palestine. And I said, who owns the land? And he didn't get the right answer, which is what surprised me. It's like, it's like right there in the Torah. It's like,
very simple. It's actually
God.
By the way, you could sort of always say that and be right most of the time. So what's going on here?
Here's the thing, though. What does God do? God gives it all, including God's own self, to us. So the one whom by right it would seem everything belongs, doesn't stake anything for himself, but gives it all to us freely in the hopes that we will reciprocate.
Okay, so hold on. I want to hold on to a particular move because it's landing on me more clearly now, and I think it's really good. So what we typically find ourselves doing. So I'm going to use the game A, game B frame again because it's easier for me to navigate that way. What we typically will do is we will take the game A character, game B player, and we will produce a game A simulacrum of the game B player. All right. So he looks like, say, a pacifist, or he looks like a guy who gives a lot of money to charity, or he looks like, or even go with like, forgive somebody slaps you, turns the other cheek. He turns the other cheek, right? The point is he engages in some subset of all of the behaviors that one sees from the authentic game B player, or the authentic hanged man, or Christ, but without actually inverting, without actually repenting, let's say, without actually flipping it upside down and now being governed by
that's the kind of and obviously that happens, and when people do that like opens them up to the legitimacy of the Nietzschean critique, where you're doing it, but it's all a ruse for power. Yes. That's what I'm saying. We make it transactional. Because we hope, even it's like, okay, even if I can't be the powerful, and Chris Green says this in the sermon too, it's like, even if I can't be the powerful one, at least I can ingratiate myself with power and get close to power by following this formula. It's like, no, which is not, by the way, precisely what, again, going back to the Good Samaritan, is precisely not what the Good Samaritan does. Whereas, and we don't have that, and this is why Illich is right. We've lost access to that by turning it into a moralism, into a formula.
Exactly. So it's the thing is not behave like the Good Samaritan behaved, right? Don't carbon copy the Good Samaritan. It's rather become one who can receive the Father's word like the Good Samaritan did.
Because what you do when you follow that will be just as unthinkable as what the Good Samaritan did is thinkable now.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. Exactly. And you could and exactly. And so we can keep playing with, you can like, and don't become unthinkable, because that's just, you're doing the same thing increasingly esoteric. There's a thing that is very real, very real. It's very real. It's very simple and really hard. But it's the place. Like, that's the place. Once you can get there, then you begin, and faith. There's a lot of stuff. Hey, there's a new person.
That's my boy.
Dawson has entered the chat.
No,
he didn't come in virtually.
Okay.
So
let me pause the recording here really quick. Interrupted for a moment. But we're back. Did you want to go ahead and do you remember what you were saying? Did you want to complete your thought?
Well, I mean, I would just maybe, the focus is on the particularities of how the serpent tricks us into giving us back something that simulates repentance, simulates the hanged man. And there's so many ways to get tricked. Like the one, I guess there's three that are easy. Right? One is the person who lives according to the law. The second is the person who does the right behavior, or emulates, which is kind of the same thing, but at a deeper level. And then the third is the person who does it all right, but from his own understanding, meaning he's not yet gone through the inversion from mind, heart, will to will, heart, mind.
Right. Yeah, this is like, I think this is like Lewis's genius in the Screwtape Letters. Like, he so masterfully like shows like all of this. Have you read it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think like that's kind of like unveiling all those clever little tricks is kind of what goes on within the Screwtape Letters. And but there, a lot of them are like, yeah, you've got it. I mean,
you're good.
Yeah, you got it figured out.
Which is interesting. So the notion is something like the inverse. Sorry, maybe I actually want to back up. Part of the reason why that comes to my mind is that happened a lot in the Game B period of time, because almost everybody endeavored to emulate the image of a Game B player from the point of view of fundamentally being still a Game A player.
Right.
All right. And I'm just saying that that's the generalized problem. Like that's an example, and it happens in that context. But the point is that it happens in all the contexts.
Yeah, I'm going to make a little bit of a Barfieldian shift here, because I think this is part of what I think we have to accept. On the other hand, I think we have to accept this a certain level of disingenuousness and LARPing along the way. And because I think that's the only way, because
Yeah.
I think it would crush us otherwise, because the road to where we're trying to get is a very long and arduous road. And so I think the way this ties to Barfield is very clear that there is no way back to original participation. So that would be like essentially, ultimately, that would be like the pre-fall state, like the Edenic consciousness is ultimately like that's ultimately the state of original participation that we're trying to, and a lot of times people just want to get straight back there and just skip all the steps. So, but there's a way in which we have to have the way toward final participation for us is one of conscious endeavor. And sometimes that does involve us just faking it until we make it. And I think, which is why embodied ritual is so important for us.
Nice.
Right?
Yes.
So we're going to have we're going to screw up. We're going to have doubts. We're going to end up trying to we're going to end up subverting the kingdom while trying to bring the kingdom. Like that's going to happen.
Yep.
But God still wants us to play.
Yep. And he's constantly,
which is kind of what I was trying to get around to saying, like, that was my word for you is, hey, Jordan, glad you're on board, but God still wants you to play.
Oh, I've never stopped playing.
Yeah.
So that's just, I've never stopped playing. It's just that the process of going through the inversion is disorienting, and it's tricky because you have to go, you kind of leave one, even just like a pinky toe on the other side, right?
And we need Sabbath.
We need
Sabbath, right? We need Sabbath.
Yeah, that's nice.
We need Sabbath. God calls on us to observe Sabbath.
Yeah. That's nice. Well, in fact, not just we need Sabbath, as you say, like we actually are centered in Sabbath, and then the other 6 days start to come back online.
Well, it's like, Tom Burke has a saying that he uses throughout Meditations on Matero, which is like, it's an old monastic saying, like ora et labora, work and prayer. Mm-hmm. Like we need the cycles of both, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. The image is something like a typical move would be like going underwater, wearing one of those old dive suits that has a tube still going back up to the air.
Right.
And that's not what God's asking. What God's saying is, no, what's going to happen is you're actually going to learn how to become a merman, right? You're going to actually learn how to breathe the water.
Yes.
And what's going to happen is
I love this analogy.
Yeah. And so you're under, and you're having to learn how to navigate, including all the way to the level of how do you metabolize a whole new environment, right? So a different environment. But the Sabbath is the first thing I'm going to do, if you really embrace this and you really come through, just think about like the peace that surpasses all understanding. Like really grasp the fact that I have mercy to give you. I can give you, can and do give you peace. I give you mercy, or I give you grace. And so what happens is it's like you suddenly discover that, I can breathe. I don't know how to swim now. I don't know how to navigate underwater properly, but I'm no longer tethered to my own understanding, to this cybernetic relationship or technological relationship with reality. I'm actually now becoming a native of the water.
Yes, I like that. Let's talk about technology for a minute, actually, because so on the one hand, and I mentioned it a little at the beginning. I kind of referenced a little briefly at the very beginning of the conversation, right? So Lowell always hated the translation of technique as technology. He did not like that because what he was talking about was at a deeper level than what the English word technology expresses. He was actually talking about systems, essentially. Like all all systems contribute to the phenomenon of technique.
Mm-hmm.
But he would also say things like interesting things like it's important. Like he said, it's important to be aware of the operations of technique, but I'm not going to stop using the telephone.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is where I think and I've had Paul Kingsnorth on the channel before, and I like Paul, and I think he says a lot of really powerful, important things that are completely rooted in the gospel. But I think I don't know that I believe that our technology is irredeemable. I think it really is as long as we change the fundamental technique that is at the core of the game that we are playing, then there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, this is the AB thing. It's not that the stuff that has come. Let's just go with just say technology, but there's many other things. It's not that anything that God has created is fundamentally evil. That's actually an easier way of saying it.
Right. Yes. Correct. Right.
It's just that if we are governed by the laws of scarcity, if we are governed by the laws of
that
power,
is it. That is exactly it. It's governed by the laws of scarcity, and it's that's precisely it. And that's what the problem that we have with technology is, that in the history of our technological development, it has tended to serve the needs of power.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Simple that's the problem. That's really it. But it's the idea of technology that is in the service of the idea of technology that is in the service not of power, but of the arcanum of force is not inconceivable.
Not at all.
It's not at all. Yeah, precisely right. And so it's just a matter of changing the game, basically.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
Changing the game. And again, it's just what I discovered is that by far the hardest part is this pivot at will. It's not my will, it's thy will. And it's a real thing, really for sure, noticing that your will is being moved before your heart and well before your mind. That's a wild place to be for everybody who's been raised by and for game A. And that's really disorienting. It's wild. What the heck? I don't understand.
Can you give just for the listeners? Can you give an example of of how
Sure. I mean, I could do it. I'll do it in a way that is very simple and then less simple as it goes on.
Sure.
So I remember talking. I think you may even have watched it with Karen about this thing of painting. Remember, she used to have this practice where she would sit outside and she would say, "Hey, put a dot on the painting."
Right.
Well, that's a great example, right? Because what's happening is your will is being moved. You're engaging in an action. You have no idea. You're not planning it, right? You're not thinking about it. You're not designing it. There's no pre-planning. There's no image in your mind. You're not like, oh, it's a lion I'm painting. It's rather, I'm literally allowing my hand to be guided by something completely that I don't understand at all. And yet, as an artist, she notices that it does hang together. And what she discovers as she begins the process of being in relationship with the canvas, as it's been pixelated by various people, she begins to notice. So what happens is her heart begins to feel that which has been the will that has guided all of his diverse hands. And then her mind has this experience of a curiosity and finally an epiphany of, oh, it is a lion's face. How cool is that? Right. Shoop, and then it snaps into place. It's like with this experience. So I'll go another simple one. By the way, this is even more simple. This is the arcanum of the moon. A puzzle, like you're doing a puzzle, and you have that experience where you kind of notice that a certain piece, you feel, weirdly enough, you feel the piece definitely goes in this location. And it's weird sometimes because you can pick it out, go, that, and you pick it up. And your hand drops it in, and then you drop in. All of a sudden, you have the experience of seeing the picture come together. You know what I'm saying? It becomes a whole. And that experience of noticing that something in you was able to notice what rightness was well in advance of you actually seeing the picture come together is the same idea. Now, I'll take it up a level or make it more complex. Like I oftentimes now even language it as something like, I seem to be, like this question, I'm not quite sure what's going on. I'm looking around, I'm seeing a lot of things that are happening in the world, and I seem to be, something seems to be what's happening, but I don't know what it is. But what part of it has a feeling of like solidity to it? What's a step that I can take that has a real clarity and solidity to it? Yeah, this. Okay, great. That's simple. Because, sorry, I'm going a little bit of hard field, but think about this notion of strategy, action, and planning. It's nice to have a plan, but the reality is you can really actually only do the thing that is the next thing. Like you can't actually do the third thing, right? You can only do the next thing.
Right.
And so as long as you are doing the next thing with real solidity, then you're doing the best that you could ever have done anyway, right? The fact that you don't necessarily know what the third step is going to be is irrelevant as long as the next step is
honestly
grounded.
Almost like there's almost the more competent you are at something, the less consciously you're acting.
You got it. Like that. And so this is the master-slave dichotomy is wrong, but the master is completely right.
Right.
God is not a master in the master-slave dichotomy. He is a master in the sense of one who has mastery over. He understands how to have such an intimacy with reality that every choice is impeccable. All right. That's so I say.
Well, and right now what you're talking about, that's the very first arcane, concentration without effort.
Exactly. And so the experience becomes an experience of being in a relationship with all the choices in life in that way. Meaning, hey, what are you doing? Hey, I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely going in the right direction. It's going to be beautiful. Yeah. It is beautiful. It's becoming more and more beautiful. And then finally, like, oh, it turns out I was carving a lion out of wood. That's neat.
Yeah.
Get it? Like that inversion.
No, I have that experience in conversations continually, which is why I do them. That's why I don't do any monologue videos on my channel at all. It's always conversations. And the reason that I don't do monologues is that there's a way in which, like, you know, I could show off my writing and speaking skills if I did monologue videos, as opposed to like stumbling in a natural conversation with verbal pauses and all the things that happen there. But the thing is that I would not have the possibility of what happens in a real good faith organic conversation, which is that actually happens, where it's like, oh, like, where did that come from?
Yep.
Like, and I have no idea how what just happened, but it happens nonetheless.
We have to enter into a relationship. There's a more noticeable divide. It's somewhat clear, actually. You can see it when you and I are entering into a relationship that is mutually governed by force.
Yep.
Not governed by power.
That's right.
All right. Of course, and what I'm saying is that if we're entering into a relationship governed by power, it'd be somewhat obvious. Like you see that it's clear. And what you notice is that nothing generative can come from that. Nothing creative enters into.
You just have an endless string of, you know, atheist versus believer debates.
Yeah, you might get
completely non-productive.
You might get a sort of like a good move. Like it might be a combat, right? There may be something like a combat.
Right. There's exactly right. Yeah, strategically interesting.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. But it's not the same kind of thing. And so, and you could do this monologuing too. Like I don't know if you've watched any of my deep code videos, but that's how I did it, which was I would just sort of like notice that something vague but real was at the point of just being ready to be expressed. And then I'd record it, one shot, no editing, no thinking about it at all, express it in an uninterrupted monologue, which obviously may or may not have been extremely clumsy or whatever, and then cut and then ship, meaning endeavoring to be in that same place of just let it be governed by what's happening.
Got you. Yeah. Well, because you're never really alone.
You're never really alone, exactly. So you're always in dialogue. So the challenge there is I'm in dialogue with the Holy Spirit.
The whole thing is a dialogue.
That's right. The whole thing's a dialogue.
This is a call and response reality, folks.
And a creative one, like a call and response, creative and unthinkable. Oh, I love that one. The unthinkability of it, which makes it now also exciting and beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's fantastic. All right, I think that's a good place to wrap this one up. I think that's nice. That's a great note to end on. Thank you for your time.
Yes,
Gordon, I appreciate it. I will have to talk again sometime because I think there's more to say, but not in one conversation.
Yeah. It'd be very nice. I'd enjoy it.
All right.
All right, brother.
I'll be in touch.
Sounds good.